If you ever caught a single carriage train down a rural branch line in Britain, the little one with the big curving windscreens that locals nicknamed the bubble car, you rode a Gloucester carriage. The same firm built Toronto's first subway, the carriages that ran beneath the Thames on the District Line, and Argentina's presidential coach. At its peak, 2,400 craftsmen worked 28 acres on Bristol Road, on a site so large it had its own power station. They survived the American Civil War cotton recession, survived the loss of 821 of their men in the trenches, survived the Great Depression, the general strike, and the bombing of British cities, built Churchill tanks in 1941 on the same floors that had built Pullman saloons, and then, after 126 years on Bristol Road, the gates closed. How does a works that survived all of that simply disappear? How does a city forget what it built? Chapter 1. The First Sod. To understand what was lost on the Bristol Road, you have to begin in 1860, in Gloucester, a cathedral city sitting at the crossroads of England, with the Severn at its back and the canal at its side. The country was in the middle of a railway frenzy. The length of British track had nearly doubled in a decade. Coal output had risen from 60 million tonnes a year to over 80, and every colliery and every ironworks in the kingdom was desperate for wagons, and a barrister called Richard Potter saw an opportunity. Potter was 42 years old, the son of a radical Liberal MP for Wigan. Called to the bar in 1840, but more interested in business than briefs. He had already made one fortune, a Crimean War fortune of all things, by suggesting that the British Army needed prefabricated wooden huts to survive a Russian winter. His firm, Price and Company of Gloucester, built 500 huts in the first contract. Then 1,850 more for Napoleon III's French army. Then the components for Isambard Kingdom Brunel's 1,000-bed hospital at Renkioi, on the Dardanelles, where Florence Nightingale tended the wounded. That's the man who chaired a meeting on the 30th of January 1860, at which a new joint stock company was formed for the manufacture of railway wagons. Capital of £100,000 divided into 10,000 shares of £10 each. The Gloucester Wagon Company Limited, one of the first British concerns to operate under the new Limited Liability Acts, a corporate creature, then a novelty. Gloucester in 1860 was a cathedral city of around 17,000 souls, with a port still busy with grain barges and timber lighters, and a population that had been growing fast since the canal joined the Severn to the sea. On the 10th of April 1860, Potter cut the first sod of a new works on Bristol Road, just south of the Gloucester docks, on a parcel of land that the Midland Railway had been only too pleased to sell at a good price. Beneath the first stone of the workshops, they buried a sealed bottle, coins of the period, a parchment with the names of the directors and the general manager, a small capsule of beginnings laid down by men who could not possibly have known they were founding something that would last 126 years. The general manager was a man called Isaac Slater. He had 120 men under him and a single instruction: build wagons. By the end of that first year, those 120 men had built 313 wagons. By July 1861, they were turning out 50 a week. By the end of the second year, they had produced nearly 2,000. A profit of £12,000 sat in the books. The directors began to think about expansion almost immediately. Why Gloucester? Geography. The city sat at the crossroads of England, on the Gloucester and Berkeley Canal, within reach of the ports at Sharpness and Bristol, close to the coalfields of the Forest of Dean and the West Midlands in South Wales. The 5-acre site on Bristol Road was served by the Midland Railway's High Orchard branch. You could bring timber in by canal, iron in by rail, and ship wagons out the same way. It was as if someone had drawn a map of the British railway industry and stuck a pin precisely where Gloucester sat. The strategic decision the founders made was to concentrate on coal wagons. One of the very first orders was for 1,000 coal wagons for the West Midland Railway. In Victorian Britain, the companies that shipped freight typically owned their own wagons. They hired private builders to make them, painted them in their own livery, and ran them across the network. This was the private owner wagon market, and from the 1860s onwards, Gloucester would be one of its great suppliers. The first proper crisis came in 1862, when the American Civil War cut Britain's cotton supply and the Lancashire mills collapsed. The whole economy faltered. The new wagon company could have folded at that moment, like so many young ventures before it. Instead, and this is the detail that tells you something about what kind of place this was going to become. In the middle of a recession, the works produced Britain's first all-iron goods wagon, an 8-ton open wagon, built from iron rather than wood, a pivot, a bet on the future. 70 years before the firm would be pioneering all-welded steel construction, it was already pioneering all-iron. Potter himself did not stay forever. In 1863, he returned to the board of the Great Western Railway and was elected its chairman. Later, he chaired the Canadian Grand Trunk Railway from Boston, where he kept a house and from which he managed his American investments. He had become, in the words of a recent biographer, a new kind of businessman, a corporate capitalist, equally at home in Gloucester and Boston, on a railway board and in a courtroom. And yet here is the strange detail, the one that tells you the texture of 19th century Britain. The same man who had built a Victorian capitalist empire, Crimean huts, Gloucester wagons, 2 transcontinental railways, was raising, in his Gloucestershire household, a daughter called Beatrice Potter, who would marry Sidney Webb and become Beatrice Webb, who would co-found the London School of Economics, who would, more than any other single figure, draw the architectural plans for the British welfare state. The father who built the carriages that moved an empire raised the daughter who designed the safety net that empire's working classes had been demanding. 2 lives, 1 household, a whole century's worth of contradictions held inside a single family. Chapter 2. All-Iron Ambition. Through the 1860s and 70s, the works grew. The 5-acre site of 1860 saw its first major extension in 1876. By then, the company was no longer just a wagon builder for the British market. It had become an exporter. The first foreign order arrived in 1867, 500 sets of wagon ironwork for the Great Indian Peninsula Railway. The second, for complete carriages, came from the Buenos Aires Great Southern Railway in Argentina. The first home carriage order, for railway coaches, rather than goods wagons, came from the London, Chatham and Dover Railway. Within 7 years of cutting the first sod, the Gloucester Wagon Company was supplying rolling stock to 4 continents. And then there was Russia. In 1868, the works took a £230,000 order from the Oral and Vitebsk Railway, Tsarist Russia's expanding network. Rolling stock was to be exported in kit form for assembly at a Gloucester-supervised works in Riga on the Baltic coast. Hundreds of wagons crossed the North Sea in pieces. There is a detail in the Russian story that captures the strangeness of doing business in the Tsarist Empire. The contract required a special grease for the wagon axles, not the standard mineral grease that British engineers normally specified, but a non-toxic alternative. The reason was simple. Across the famine-prone regions the Russian wagons would serve, peasants had been eating the axle grease. The standard British grease was poisonous. It was killing them. The works built wagons to carry Russian grain across Russian distances and had to specify food-safe grease in the contract, because Russian peasants, in years of bad harvest, would scrape it off the axles and eat it. Riga did not last. The local labour proved too poor for the precision work, and the assembly plant was shut down. But the Russian orders kept coming for years, and so did the orders from elsewhere: India, Argentina, Australia, Canada, West Africa, a list that would grow until, by the turn of the century, the firm reportedly maintained 600 depots and outposts scattered across the world. The Edwardian decade was the firm's first true boom. Between 1905 and the outbreak of war, in 1914, Gloucester took orders that ran from electric multiple units for the Madras and Southern Maharashtra Railway to handsome saloon coaches for railways in California. The board was lined with men whose names carried weight beyond Gloucester. Sir Richard Vassar Smith, Gloucester-born, twice mayor of the city, who would go on to chair Lloyd's Bank, sat as chairman from 1910. Stanley Baldwin, who would one day be Prime Minister, joined the board in 1906 and stayed for several years before politics took him to Downing Street. The Wagon Works was not just a Gloucester employer, it was a place that drew the attention of men who ran the country. In 1888, the firm reorganised. It absorbed a wagon hiring subsidiary, sold off its old tea-station works and re-registered under a new name, the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, GRCW, the name it would carry for the rest of its life. From now on, it was not just wagons. It was carriages, passenger coaches, with all the craft and finish that implied. Upholsterers and French polishers walked the floor alongside fitters and smiths. By the 1890s, the company was building things that had no obvious right to exist. In 1886, horse-drawn trams for the city of Gloucester. In 1894, the most peculiar railway vehicle ever to come out of the works, the Pioneer, a gantry car for Magnus Volk's Brighton and Rottingdean Seashore Electric Railway. The Pioneer stood 40 feet tall on stilts. It ran through the sea between Brighton and Rottingdean on submerged rails. It carried passengers on a deck high above the waves, like a giant Victorian pier on wheels. It required a qualified sea captain to drive it. Gloucester built it. In 1897, a monorail carriage for Bear's Lightning Express demonstrated at the Brussels exhibition. In 1898, electric taxicabs for the London Electric Cab Company, a pre-Edwardian attempt at urban electric transport, decades ahead of its time. A saloon car body for the King of the Belgians. Horse-drawn ambulances for the Boer War, one of which served as the headquarters wagon of the Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Lord Roberts. In 1910, the firm took its first London Underground order, E-stock cars for the District Railway, the start of a 30-year relationship that would run through G-stock in the 20s, Standard stock for the Piccadilly line in the early 30s, O and P stock for the Hammersmith and City, and Q stock for the District in 1939. The largest single order in the firm's first 80 years arrived in 1937, £1.5 million, 401 P-stock and Q-stock carriages for London transport. The District line that ran under the Thames was, in the most literal sense, a Gloucester production. The slogan in the Gloucester catalogues read, "Every carriage and wagon is yet another ambassador for British craftsmanship." It was the kind of slogan you only believed was justified when you had actually seen the work. In 1910, the company also delivered Argentina's presidential railway coach, a state carriage that would later carry Eva Perón herself, and which still exists in Argentina today. In 1936, on the eve of the war that would change everything, Gloucester completed what was probably the most luxurious railway carriage ever constructed in Britain. A 68-foot air-conditioned state coach for the Maharaja Holkar of Indore, sycamore panelling, chrome fittings, pink-tinted mirrors, internal telephones, air blown over blocks of ice for cooling, as a substitute for the air conditioning the works had not quite yet mastered. An Art Deco interior fit for a film set. The Maharaja was overthrown before delivery. The coach survived. It is still in India. By then, the workshops on Bristol Road had grown to 28 acres. Chapter 3. Ambassadors for British Craftsmanship. You arrived at the gates on Bristol Road early, because the morning shift started at 7. If you were a coach builder's apprentice in 1937, you walked down from the terraces off Stroud Road or up from the docks, and you joined a stream of 2,400 men converging on the same set of gates. The works hooter sounded. The rhythm of the day began. The first thing you noticed was the scale of it. 28 acres, 600 yards of frontage along Bristol Road, from Baker Street down to Clifton Road. A complex so large it had its own electricity generating station, 6 Babcock and Wilcox water tube boilers feeding a Westinghouse Parsons turbine, and 2 Roby engine-coupled generators, churning out 980 kilowatts of direct current at 230 volts. In summer, the works used 33,000 units a month. In winter, when the carriage shops needed light from 6 in the morning till 7 at night, it climbed to nearly 60,000, a small town's worth of electricity produced entirely on site to keep the looms of carriage building running. The works was a series of vast sheds, each devoted to a phase of construction. At one end, the timber yards, said to hold the finest stock of seasoned timber in Britain, brought in by canal and rail from Norway, from Burma, from Honduras, the mahogany for the saloon panels, the teak for the underframes of tropical carriages destined for India, the English oak for the chassis. In the woodworking shops, the saws and planes and lathes turned that timber into the bones and skin of a railway carriage. Coach builders cut to patterns drawn up in the office on the second floor, where Frank Barber, chief draftsman, who had joined the firm in February 1935, presided over a drafting room of 50 men with pencils and slide rules and Indian ink. Every carriage began on Barber's boards. In the metalworking shops, the smiths and fitters built sole bars and bogies and underframes. Pneumatic riveters chattered. A 150-ton press stamped out steel sections. The metallic crack of rivets being driven, the wet hiss of acetylene torches, the grit of metal shavings underfoot. Then the carriage erecting shop, where the wooden body was raised onto the steel underframe. This was the largest single space, a cathedral of construction, with carriages in various stages of completion lined up along parallel tracks. A finished carriage left the erecting shop on its own wheels, ready for the paint shop. The paint shop took weeks. A railway carriage in 1937 received as many as 15 coats: primer, undercoat, top coat, and varnish, each one rubbed down by hand between coats. The men who worked in the paint shop had the most distinctive uniforms in the works: white overalls, white caps. Fingers stained the colour of whatever job they were on. And then the upholstery shop, where the seats were stuffed and buttoned and the moquette cloth was cut and fitted. Women worked here, primarily. The upholstery section was one of the few parts of the works where women had been present in numbers even before the wars. What had been raw timber and bare steel 4 months earlier left the works as a Pullman carriage destined for Argentina, or a district line train destined for the London Underground, or a state coach destined for an Indian princely house. The smells changed as you moved through the buildings. Sawdust and pine resin in the timber yards, hot oil and burnt iron in the smithy, the sharp chemical tang of cellulose paint and shellac varnish in the paint shop, the wool and glue smell of upholstery, the faint, sweet smoke of the works canteen where 500 dinners a day came out of the kitchen. The chief engineer, in those years, was a man called Fred Sinclair. Sinclair had spent his career working on bogie design, the trucks at each end of a carriage that carry the wheels and the springs, and on which the whole quality of a railway ride depends. By the 1950s, Sinclair's Gloucester bogie and his metallastic suspension design would push back the frontiers of bogie technology and become the products that kept the works alive after carriage building had ended. But that was still in the future. In 1937, Sinclair was simply the best bogie engineer in Britain, and Gloucester was his laboratory. Production was organised contract by contract. A single carriage erecting shop might be turning out goods vans for the LMS at one end, underground stock for London transport in the middle, and a presidential state coach for Buenos Aires at the other. The mix was constant. The men shifted from job to job. Every product was photographed before it left the works. The company maintained a meticulous photographic archive that would eventually run to 120 albums and over 1,600 negatives. A staff photographer worked full-time, recording every carriage and every wagon that came out of the Bristol Road gates. The slogan was on the front cover of every catalogue. Every carriage and wagon is yet another ambassador for British craftsmanship. Chapter 4. The Town the Carriages Built. The works did not just employ Gloucester, it made Gloucester in important ways. 2,400 wage packets a week flowed out of the gates on Bristol Road and into the pubs and the corner shops and the terraced housing of the city's south side. Multi-generational. Fathers brought in sons, uncles brought in nephews. A trade learnt at Bristol Road was a trade for life. The works had its own brass band, photographed in 1916 in smart uniforms with the bandmaster front and centre. It had its own sports ground at Tuffley Avenue, the Wingett Ground, bought with retained profits from the Great War, and for decades, the venue of the Gloucester Cricket Festival. It had its own apprenticeship system, which trained coach builders and painters and upholsterers and fitters and smiths and draftsmen, each on a 5 or 7 year indenture. In 1911, the firm tried to introduce a modern timesheet system. Until then, payment had worked on the old piece system. A piece boss would collect a lump sum for a completed job and divide it among his men, in an echo of the little butty system of the Forest of Dean coal mines. The new system asked the men to fill in timesheets themselves. 1,500 of them gathered round the Nelson Foster Memorial Fountain at the junction of Southgate Street and Stroud Road, and they walked out. They were paid for production, they said, not for paperwork. The directors backed down. A dedicated timekeeper was appointed. The piece system continued. The working week was 53 hours. In 1912, the chairman, a Mr. McGregor, offered the men a profit-sharing scheme. The Works Committee, suspicious, turned it down. The men preferred their wages straight. In 1926, when the general strike paralysed Britain, the works carried on. Wagons kept being built. Carriages kept being painted. Whatever Gloucester thought of the miners' grievances, and the works was always strongly unionised, with the National Amalgamated Society of Railway Wagon and Carriage Builders and lifters well organised on site, the gates stayed open. Then came the wars. When the Great War broke out in August 1914, the works was finishing a large order of Argentine grain wagons. There were no reserved occupations yet, no shielding of skilled industrial workers. The men joined up in droves. Some never came back. By Armistice Day, 821 Gloucester railway carriage and wagon men had died in uniform. From a workforce of less than 2,000 at the time of mobilisation, 821. More than 4 in every 10 men of fighting age who had walked through those gates in August 1914. Their names went up on a roll of honour in the offices. The same name often repeated: 3 Smiths, 4 Joneses, the fingerprint of a workforce drawn from the same handful of streets. During the war itself, the works turned its hand to anything the army needed: stretchers, ambulances, shells, replacement French rolling stock for tracks blown up at the front. After the armistice, the firm built the sports ground at Tuffley Avenue from its retained profits, a memorial of a kind, though not of the official sort. By 1939, when the Second War came, Britain had learnt the lesson. Skilled engineering workers were declared reserved occupations. The works was put onto military production almost immediately, but its men stayed in Gloucester. What it made then was extraordinary. The first Vauxhall-designed Churchill tank rolled out of the Bristol Road gates in June 1941. 45 tons of steel, a Vauxhall flat 12 engine, built on the same erecting shop floors that had been producing Pullman carriages a year earlier. The works would go on to build 764 Churchill tanks before the war ended. Bridge layers, flail tanks, infantry tanks. A meaningful share of the total of 5,640 made across all British manufacturers. You could stand on the gallery above the erecting shop in 1942 and look down at the floor and see something that would have seemed impossible to Isaac Slater 80 years earlier. Where once the men had been cutting mahogany panels for an Indian princely saloon, they were now welding 3-inch armour plate. Where once the smell had been sycamore and shellac, it was cordite and arc flash. The carriage builders had become tank builders, and on quieter days, when an unfinished hull was being lowered onto its bogies, the rhythm of the work was almost the same. The works also built Mulberry Harbour sections, specifically the whale-pivoting roadway sections that would float across the English Channel after D-Day and become the floating quays on the Normandy beaches. It built Bailey bridges, 25-pounder shells, Spitfire propellers for Rottall in Cheltenham, torpedo wagons for the Royal Navy, wooden shoe soles. Whatever was needed, the works made it. Queen Mary visited twice, the Queen Consort in a hat and a fur stole, walking through the carriage, erecting shop, talking to the men. After the war, the carriages came back. London Underground stock, British Railways Mark I coaches, foreign export orders began rebuilding. The same craft, the same skill, the same gates on Bristol Road. By the early 1950s, the works was full again. 2,400 men, 28 acres, bogies designed by Fred Sinclair under the modernisation plan, carriages being built to ride on tracks across India, across Australia, across South America, across the new networks being built in newly independent countries who needed British rolling stock to replace what they had inherited from Empire. And then came the order that would put Gloucester, briefly, at the centre of the world. Chapter 5. The Summit. In 1951, the Toronto Transit Commission decided it needed a subway. Canada had never had one. The decision was a leap of national ambition, a statement that Toronto would become the kind of city Toronto was deciding to be, a metropolis, not a colonial town. The contract was open to bidders from across North America and Europe. The competition was fierce. The works had spent 30 years building underground stock for London, 6 successive fleets, each one tested against fierce competition from Birmingham, from Manchester, from Metropolitan Camel. The fact that Toronto's officials had landed in Gloucester rather than in any of the rival shops was the result of 3 decades of accumulated reputation. Smoothness of ride, quality of finish, reliability over decades, on lines where reliability mattered most. The TTC's officials had ridden the London Underground on a research visit, and they had been struck by one thing in particular: the smoothness of the ride. The underground trains they had travelled on had been built by Gloucester. Their bogies were Fred Sinclair's. The men in the carriage shops on Bristol Road had built them. Gloucester won. 104 subway cars, at a cost of $7.8 million Canadian dollars. The firm had persuaded Toronto to adopt 57-foot cars rather than the 48-foot they had originally specified, saving the city around $1.5 million in tunnel construction. In all, between 1953 and 1959, Gloucester built 140 cars for the Toronto subway. The order grew to $11.5 million. On the 30th of March 1954, Canada's first subway opened. A Gloucester-built train pulled out of Eglinton Station and ran south down Yonge Street. Mayor Alan Lamport stood on the platform. He said later that this was the day the modern Toronto was born. The trains were nicknamed Red Rockets in Toronto, and Torontonians loved them. They ran in service until the 26th of October 1990. 36 years. Some of the second-generation aluminium cars Gloucester built were the first known structural use of aluminium in a subway car. Pioneering metallurgy applied to mass transit, designed and built in a Gloucestershire works. Back on Bristol Road, Sir Leslie Boyce, chairman of the firm, commissioned 2 scale models of the Toronto cars to mark the contract. The models still exist. They sit, the last time anyone checked, at the Toronto Transit Commission's Hillcrest Centre. On the 3rd of May 1955, Queen Elizabeth II came to Gloucester. She toured the works. Deputy Chairman J.H. Beech guided her round. Leslie Smith took Prince Philip. Fred Sinclair, the bogeyman, escorted the equerry. Sir Leslie Boyce himself was too ill to attend, having handed over the chairmanship 2 months earlier. The men of the works lined the carriage erecting shop and watched the Queen walk past finished underground trains and half-built coaches bound for Australia, India, Argentina. In 1957, a rolling stock exhibition was held at Battersea Wharf in London. 5 British manufacturers showed their best work: Cravens, Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon, Metropolitan Camel, the English electric Deltic diesel locomotive, and Gloucester. Of all the exhibits at Battersea Wharf, only 3 were filmed by the newsreels in colour, then a costly novelty. The Deltic was one. Gloucester's 2 British Railways carriages were the other 2. That was the Summit, a 1937 site with its own power station. 2,400 craftsmen on 28 acres, rolling stock for half the railways of the Commonwealth, pioneering structural aluminium for mass transit, newsreel cameras in colour, the reigning monarch walking the carriage erecting shop, the trains that Toronto would remember as the moment its modern history began. This was the Summit, the highest point, and what nobody in the carriage erecting shop on Bristol Road understood. Not Frank Barber at his drawing boards, not Fred Sinclair on the bogey line, not the apprentice coach builders coming through the gates that summer, was that the Summit was where the firm had run out of mountain. The next chapter would begin with a single decision about an aluminium train for the London Underground. A decision about what kind of aluminium to use. A decision that would cost Gloucester an order for 1,600 vehicles and bring British Railways workshop rationalisation into a sharper focus than anyone in the carriage shops yet realised. The fall began here. Chapter 6. The Coffin Nails. The decision was about aluminium. In 1957, the works built a 7-car aluminium train for London Transport's Piccadilly line. It was an experimental train, built in competition with Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon and with Metropolitan Camel. The prize, if Gloucester won, was an order for 1,600 vehicles, the largest London Underground contract ever offered to a single manufacturer. Gloucester chose to build the train from soft aluminium rather than from the hardened alloy that the rival shops had specified, and, for reasons that no surviving document quite explains, outshopped the train unpainted in its natural finish so that the riveting was fully visible. Every flaw in the work was on display. The train looked rough. The flaws were not structural. They did not affect the ride. But the train looked rough. The order for 1,600 vehicles went to Birmingham and to Metropolitan Camel, the 2 shops that would, between them, outlive Gloucester by decades. At the moment of its prestige peak, the Queen's visit, the Toronto contract, the Battersea Wharf newsreels, a single material choice had cost the works the biggest order it might ever have won. It was not yet a fatal decision. The works was still full. But it was the first sign of something the men at Bristol Road could not yet see. The industry was changing. The buyers were watching more closely. The margin for error was shrinking. In 1958, the works delivered something else, something that would, in the end, define how Gloucester was remembered. 20 single-carriage diesel multiple units, ordered by British Railways under the Modernisation Plan. Class 122, built on a 62-foot all-welded steel chassis, 2 BUT diesel engines, 150 horsepower each, 4-speed epicyclic gearboxes from self-changing gears in Coventry, 65 second-class seats divided into 2 saloons, one for smokers, one for non-smokers. Maximum speed 70 miles per hour, a driving cab at each end, with rounded windscreens that gave an almost panoramic view of the track ahead. 20 trains, the first delivered in April 1958, the last by July. Their nickname, almost immediately, was the bubble car. The big curving windscreens suggested the German bubble cars then being imported into Britain. Those 3-wheeled microcars that looked like little glass eggs on the road. The trains were the railway version. A single car, a bubble of glass and steel. Rural Britain in one carriage. They were built for the lightly used branch lines, the lines where a full train was too much, where a single car would do, where the economics of running 2 engines and a guard's van had stopped making sense some years before. The bubble cars were the answer. Self-contained, double-ended. No need to turn round at the end of the run. They could potter back and forth on a country branch all day, on a single tank of diesel. The Stourbridge Town branch, Britain's shortest, less than half a mile. The St Albans Abbey branch in Hertfordshire. The Dundee to Arbroath services in Scotland. The Old London and South Western lines in West Devon and North Cornwall. The Penarth and Cadoxton run in South Wales. Par to Newquay, Liskeard to Looe, St Erth to St Ives. These were the trains of childhood, the trains of market day. The trains that took you to the seaside on the last Saturday in July and brought you home sunburnt and salt-crusted on the last Sunday of the summer holidays. The trains the Western Region crews called, behind the works back, the coffin nails. Because if you saw a bubble car arrive on your branch line, the rumour ran, you knew the line was about to be closed. The Class 122s were sent to the routes that British Railways was preparing to shut. The crews were not entirely wrong. On the 27th of March, 1963, Dr Richard Beeching published his report, The Reshaping of British Railways, 2,363 stations to close, 5,000 miles of track to be lifted, 55% of all British stations, 30% of the route mileage, 67,700 railway jobs to go. Many of the branches the bubble cars had been built to serve were on the list. The bitter irony was that the trains outlived their executioners. The last passenger bubble car ran in service in December 1993. The last related Gloucester unit ran on the main line as a Sandike carriage on the 19th of May 2017. 59 years after the first one rolled out of Bristol Road. 8 of the 20 power cars survive in preservation today, lovingly restored, still rattling along heritage lines for tourists. The coffin nails outlived the railways they were meant to serve, and they outlived the works that built them. But that is the long view. In 1960, in the Carriage erecting shop on Bristol Road, nobody knew any of this yet. They knew only that the orders were thinning out, that British Railways was building more of its own diesel multiple units at Derby and at York and at Swindon, that the foreign export work, the markets in India, in Argentina, in Australia, was being chased by competitors from West Germany and from Japan who had not existed as railway exporters a decade earlier. The first cracks were spreading. The works was still busy. The men still arrived on the morning shift, but something had shifted, and the older hands could feel it in the rhythm of the work. Chapter 7. Beeching's Shadow. Across British engineering, 1960 was the year the music stopped. The modernisation plan that had filled the order books at Gloucester through the mid-50s, the Mark I coaches, the diesel multiple units, the bogies for half the British fleet, was, by 1960, almost complete. The new diesel multiple units that British Railways still wanted to build were increasingly built in British Railways' own workshops. Derby, York, Swindon, Crewe. The nationalised railway preferred to keep the work in its own shops. What had been a market with 5 or 6 major private builders supplying the British fleet became, almost overnight, a market with one buyer, and that buyer building more and more of its own product. The competitors began to fall. Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon. The firm that had won the 1957 Piccadilly Aluminium order, the firm against which Gloucester had been measuring itself for 60 years, closed in 1963. Cravens of Sheffield, the third great name in British carriage building, ceased rolling stock construction in 1964. Metropolitan Camel of Birmingham survived only by diversifying away from rolling stock, eventually being absorbed into the Alstom Group decades later. 3 of the 4 great Edwardian carriage builders were gone within 5 years. The export markets that had carried Gloucester through the lean years of 1930 were no easier. The newly independent Commonwealth nations that had inherited British rolling stock now had their own industries to support, their own foreign currency to preserve. India was building locomotives at Chittaranjan. Australia was rolling its own carriages at Comeng. The Argentine market that had taken Gloucester's presidential coach in 1910 was now shopping in West Germany and in Italy. In Gloucester, the response was to focus on what the works still did better than anyone else: the bogies. The trucks at each end of a railway carriage on which Fred Sinclair had built his reputation. The Gloucester bogie and the metalastic suspension were, by the early 60s, among the best in the world. If you could not build the whole carriage, you could at least supply the bogies under everyone else's carriages. It was a retreat. Skillfully managed, intelligently chosen, but a retreat all the same. The last complete carriage came off the line in November 1963. A full break, a coach with a guard's compartment and luggage space, no passenger seating, vehicle number 81628, built for British Railways. The last in an unbroken line stretching back to the 1870s, when the Wagon Company had taken its first carriage order from the London, Chatham and Dover Railway. Nobody made a particular fuss about it at the time. Carriage number 81628 rolled out of the paint shop, was inspected, was signed off, and went into traffic. The men who built it walked home at the end of the shift. The next day they were on other work. The carriage erecting shop, which had run for 96 years since the first London, Chatham and Dover coach, did not formally close. It just stopped having carriages to erect. The last complete diesel multiple unit had come the year before. 10 Class 128s, parcels units, rather than passenger units, delivered in 1959. The Class 122, bubble cars of 1958, had been the last passenger DMOS Gloucester ever built. The men did not know it at the time. They did not get to say goodbye. The work just stopped arriving. The wagons kept going for a few years more. Sheet-sided covered vans for British Railways, mineral wagons for the collieries that were themselves about to close as the National Coal Board rationalised pit by pit. The last complete wagon, a sheet-sided covered bogie van, left Bristol Road in 1968. After that, the works made only bogies and undergear, castings and suspension components, sold to whoever was still building carriages. The works was still a substantial employer. The skill was still on site, but it had become, in the language of management consultants who were just beginning to enter British boardrooms, a component supplier. The thing that for 103 years had been a maker of complete trains was now a maker of parts for other people's trains. And then the corporate takeovers began. Chapter 8. The Slow Strangulation. On the 29th of December 1961, between Christmas and the New Year, when nobody was paying close attention, the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company was acquired by Wingett Limited of Rochester in Kent. Wingett made concrete mixers. The parent company became Wingett Gloucester Limited. The Gloucester subsidiary was renamed Gloucester Engineering Company. The name on the gates changed. Most rolling stock construction ceased the following year. The men still spoke of working at the wagon works. The local press still called it the Wagon Works. But on the company stationery, the new name was already in place. You can read the meaning of that name change without anyone needing to explain it. Gloucester Engineering Company, not carriage, not wagon. Engineering in the abstract, engineering in general, engineering for whoever might want some. The 101-year-old identity that had been forged in 1860 by Richard Potter and Isaac Slater was, by a decision in a boardroom in Kent, simply removed. On the 1st of April 1968, Wingett Gloucester became a wholly owned subsidiary of Babcock and Wilcox, the great Anglo-American boilermaker, the firm whose water tube boilers had, since the 1930s, powered the Bristol Road generating station. Babcock had supplied the boilers. Now Babcock owned the works. The same year, the last complete wagon left the gates. For the next 2 decades, the works produced bogies, cast steel bogies for British Railways and for export, metalastic suspension components, whatever could be sold off the back of Fred Sinclair's old designs. The carriage erecting shop became a casting shop. The paint shop became a machine shop. The timber yards were cleared. The upholstery section was closed, and the women who had stuffed seats since the Great War were given their notices. The workforce shrank year on year. The 2,400 of 1937 was gone by the mid-60s. By the mid-70s, the works was running with a few hundred men. The Tuffley Avenue Sports Ground, the Wingett ground that the men had built with their war profits in 1919, was sold off. The brass band, which had been photographed in smart uniform in 1916, had long since stopped playing. By the early 80s, the British rolling stock industry was in its final agony. British Rail was being prepared for privatisation. The order pipeline that had still trickled with bogie work in the 70s was drying up entirely. The Conservative government's plans for the railways, which would not be enacted in their final form until the Railways Act of 1993, were already casting their shadow. No one wanted to commit to new orders for trains that might be ordered by a private operator that did not yet exist. For a works whose only product was now cast bogies for British Rail, the implication was simple. There were going to be no new orders. In 1986, Babcock Industrial and Electrical Products, the part of the Babcock empire to which Gloucester Engineering Company belonged, looked at its books and made a decision. The decision was about property. The 28 acres on Bristol Road, served by the closed High Orchard rail branch, but bordered on 3 sides by main roads, sitting on the southern edge of the Gloucester city centre and 10 minutes from the M5 motorway, was worth substantially more as development land than as a working bogie shop. This had been true for years. Everyone in the local property market had known it. What was new was the willingness, in 1986, to act on it. The works was no longer generating enough margin to outweigh the alternative. The land value had eclipsed the industrial value. A spreadsheet somewhere in Babcock's offices made the calculation explicit. Someone in a boardroom in London signed off on it. We do not know their name. The public record of the closure of the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company contains no named decision-maker, no Babcock executive, no minutes of the meeting in which it was decided. There is no Hansard reference. The Gloucester MP at the time, Mrs. Sally Oppenheim, who would later become Baroness Oppenheim-Barnes, is not recorded as having raised the matter in the Commons. The closure of one of the city's oldest and proudest employers did not, so far as the historical record shows, generate a single substantive headline in the national press. The historian who tries to write about the death of GRCW finds, in 1986, a silence in the shape of a works closing. A silence that the eulogist must acknowledge before any other word is spoken. A century and a quarter of history. 2 world wars survived. The Great Depression survived. The collapse of the export markets survived. The end of carriage building survived. The end of wagon building survived. And then, when the property value of the site finally rose above the industrial value of the work, the gates were closed by men whose names were never recorded. The bogie casting line stopped. The remaining workers were given their notices. Powell Dufferin, the South Wales Engineering Group, picked up what was left of the rolling stock business and shifted it to its Cambrian works at Maindy in Cardiff. Wagon and bogie production under Powell Dufferin standard finally ceased around 1993, but the Bristol Road works had already gone silent 7 years earlier. Chapter 9. The Gates Close. The last morning shift arrived in 1986. We do not know the exact date. The local newspaper of record, the Gloucester Citizen, would have covered it. The reports are in the Citizen's bound volumes, in Gloucestershire Archives at Clarence Row. They have not been digitised. The detail sits in a paper file, waiting for someone to walk in and look it up. What we do know is the shape of it. The men walked in through the gates on Bristol Road. They clocked on at the timekeeper's office. They walked across the yard to whatever job they had been working on the day before. They were told the works was closing, how long they had to clear the site, how long the redundancy payments would take to process, whether they would have to come back the following week to finish off the work in hand. The fine details, which would have meant everything to the men involved, are not recorded. Some of them had worked at the wagon works for 40 years. Some had walked through the gates as 14-year-old apprentices in 1945, fresh from school after the war, and were now men in their late 50s, with sons of their own who had not followed them into the trade, because by the 70s and 80s, the trade had stopped recruiting. The Tuffley Avenue sports ground was already gone. The brass band was already gone. The works canteen had already been scaled back to a tea bar for the bogie shop. The chairman and the deputy chairman who had escorted the Queen round the works in 1955 were both long dead. Sir Leslie Boyce had died in 1955, the year of the Queen's visit. J.H. Beech had retired and then died. Fred Sinclair, the bogeyman, had left the works decades earlier. Frank Barber, the chief draftsman, had retired. The last men did not know any of their predecessors. They knew only the work. The cast bogies came off the line. The patterns were boxed up and put into storage. The casting moulds were broken. The drawings, the ones that Fred Sinclair had signed in pencil in the 1940s and 50s, the ones that defined the Gloucester bogie that ran under half the carriages on the British network, were taken to be archived. Some of them are at Gloucestershire Archives now, in reference D4791. Some are at the National Railway Museum in York. Most of them are simply gone. The works hooter sounded for the last time. Nobody recorded the date. The gates closed. The men walked home down Bristol Road. Some of them passed the Nelson Foster Memorial Fountain, where their grandfathers had walked out in October 1911. The day 1,500 of them had refused to fill in timesheets. Some of them passed the streets where their fathers had grown up. Some of them to terraced houses in which 3 generations of carriage builders had lived. A few months later, the demolition began. The carriage erecting shop, the cathedral, the largest single space in the works, the place where the Queen had walked past half-built underground trains in 1955, was, for reasons no one quite recalls, the one shed they left standing. It is on Bristol Road today, near the corner of Baker Street. Externally unchanged, it now houses a karting centre. Everything else came down. In 1989, the office block, the building from which Sir Leslie Boyce had run the firm through the war years, where Frank Barber had managed the drawing office, where the photographs of every carriage ever built had been catalogued in their 120 albums, was demolished to make way for a Toys R Us store. The rest of the site was cleared for a retail park. Peel, the property developers, took on the development. The cleared site became the Peel Centre, a Burger King, a Pizza Hut, a Virgin Multiplex cinema, several other outlets, a 2-hour maximum stay car park. By the time Gloucester Quays Designer Outlet opened on the neighbouring Fielding and Platt site on the 30th of May 2009, almost no one walking through the new shopping district remembered what had stood there. The High Orchard branch of the Midland Railway had been lifted. The sidings had been concreted over. The Triaway Road ran through the cleared space. The street pattern remained. Bristol Road still bent south past the docks. Baker Street still ran off it. The terraces of Stroud Road still climbed up towards Tuffley Avenue. The shape of the city the works had built was still visible. The works itself was not. Chapter 10. What the trains outlived. What does it mean to lose a thing that the world barely noticed leaving? The firm closed without obituary. The men dispersed without recorded testimony. The Gloucester Citizen of 1986 holds the dates and the details in paper that no one has yet keyed into a database. The MP for Gloucester did not stand up in the Commons. No documentary film crew arrived at the gates to interview the last man through. No book was ever written. There is the slight anonymous centenary history, published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson in 1960 for the work's 100th birthday. There is Mike Christensen's article in the British Railway Journal of 1985. There is Keith Montague's 1981 book on the private owner wagons. And then there is silence. The works that built the Toronto subway, the works that the Queen visited, the works whose carriages were filmed in colour by the newsreels at Battersea Wharf in 1957, the works whose products carried Eva Peron across Argentina and a Maharaja's family across India. That works closed in 1986, and the public record of its closing is so thin that the basic facts must be reconstructed from a wagon enthusiast's website, a tourism board's history page, and the memory of local historians. The bubble cars outlived their builders. 8 of the 20 survive. At the South Devon Railway, at the East Lancashire, at the Battlefield Line, at the Ecclesbourne Valley, at the Great Central, at the Weardale, at the Llanelli and Mynydde Moor, and at the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway. The last one is the local survivor. Vehicle number 55003, under restoration by the Cotswold Diesel Railcar Group, built in Gloucester in 1958, and now preserved a few miles from the city where it was made. The Argentine presidential coach still exists in Argentina. The Holcar of Indoors state coach still exists in India. The Festiniog Railway in North Wales still runs the two bow-sided carriages that Gloucester delivered to it in 1879, more than 145 years ago. There are Gloucester wagons at the National Waterways Museum. There is a London Transport District Line Q-Stock motor car that runs on the Underground's vintage train. In Toronto, the Red Rockets ran until the 26th of October, 1990. By then, the works that built them had been closed for 4 years. The photographic archive, the 120 albums, the 1,600 negatives, recording almost every carriage and every wagon that came out of Bristol Road across a century, sits at Gloucestershire Archives in Clarence Row. Researchers consult it. Heritage railways draw from it. Modellers cross-reference it for the historical accuracy of their reproductions. It is the largest single record of what was built. In 2016, 3 men, Aaron Matthews, Leo Tomos Matthews and Paul Matthews, founded the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Museum, latterly hosted at the Llanelli and Mynydd Mawr Railway in West Wales, a museum for a works that has no museum in its own city, a keeping of the memory by people who were not yet born when the gates closed. Stand on Bristol Road today, near the Peel Centre car park. The sound that fills the air is the rumble of traffic on the Trier Way, the rattle of trolleys being pushed across tarmac, the chatter of shoppers walking from Home Bargains to Hobbycraft. There is no works hooter. There has not been a works hooter for 39 years. The karting centre is in the old erecting shop. If you walked into it, you would be standing on the floor where the Queen of England walked past half-built underground carriages in May 1955. The same floor where 764 Churchill tanks were welded together between 1941 and 1945. The same floor where Frank Barber's draftsmen tested their drawings against the reality of timber and steel. The same floor where the first bubble car was lowered onto its bogies in April 1958. The floor remembers nothing. Floors do not remember. But the city the carriages built remembers, in pieces. In the street names on the south side, in the terraced housing along Stroud Road, in the apprentices who became old men, in the cricket field that was once the Wingate ground, in the 8 surviving bubble cars on heritage lines across Britain, and in the trains themselves. 8 little Gloucester carriages still rattling along preserved branch lines, taking children and tourists and railway enthusiasts the same way they once took farmers and mill girls and seaside trippers. Trains designed to die on the lines Beeching closed, that instead lived on, and that survived their makers by decades. That is what remains. A coach in Argentina. A coach in India. Carriages on the Festiniog. 8 bubble cars. A photographic archive in a county records office, a museum founded by 3 men in West Wales, the shape of a city's south side, and, on Bristol Road, the old carriage erecting shop, externally unchanged, with the sound of carts where there was once the rhythm of work. The men who made it have nearly all gone now. The eldest apprentices of 1945, if they survive, are in their 90s. Their sons did not follow them into the trade. The trade no longer exists. What they built is on the rails. What they built is in the photographs. What they built is in the streets of a city's south side, where the houses and the pubs and the corner shops still sit in the pattern set down by 126 years of wages. The carriages outlived the works. The works outlived the men. And the city, which is older than any of them, will outlive even the memory of what once stood on 28 acres at the south end of Bristol Road, where Richard Potter cut the first sod on the 10th of April, 1860. The hooter is silent. The gates are gone. The trains roll on.